The wind, a ravenous beast, clawed at the weathered timber of Ilara's cabin, a desolate sentinel against the onslaught of the blizzard. Snow, fine as dust, whipped against the single pane of glass, obscuring the world beyond, a world she had long since renounced. Her past was a silent, insistent ache in her bones, a constant companion in the vast, unforgiving solitude of the Montana plains. She stoked the fire, its hungry crackle the only solace against the howling void outside, a void that mirrored the emptiness she often felt within. Every gust was a ghostly hand, rattling the door, whispering forgotten names, reminding her of the choices that had carved this life out of her, leaving only the shell of what she once was. A deep flaw, a decision born of desperation and a twisted sense of justice, had driven her here, to this edge of the world, where the wild consumed weakness and offered no absolution. Then, through the cacophony of the storm, came a faint, rhythmic pounding, a sound that sliced through the wind's shriek, sharp and insistent. It was the desperate plea of life against the encroaching silence of the plains, a sound she hadn't heard in years. Her hand, calloused and trembling slightly, instinctively reached for the old rifle propped by the hearth, its cold steel a familiar weight against her palm. She moved to the window, peering out through the swirling white chaos, her breath fogging the glass. Dim, indistinct shapes materialized from the swirling snow, horses, their heads bowed against the fury, and the hunched forms of men, struggling against the gale. They were cowboys, she knew, drifters, lost in the white oblivion, seeking refuge from the storm's merciless embrace. A shiver, colder than the wind outside, traced its way down her spine. The outside world, a threat she thought she had outrun, was knocking. She had sought isolation, a silent penance, but the world, in its cruel irony, had found her. Her heart, a tight knot of apprehension, hammered against her ribs. What did they seek? What would they see in her eyes? What shadows would they stir from her past? A past she had meticulously buried under layers of snow and silence. The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt like a fragile shell, about to shatter under the weight of an unwelcome intrusion. The knocking intensified, a blunt demand against the fragile peace she had constructed. This was the moment. She had to choose, turn them away, or open the door and invite the unknown, and perhaps the unavoidable. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The latch clicked, a sound swallowed instantly by the roaring wind, and Ilara pulled the heavy door inward, revealing two men, their faces etched with frost and exhaustion, their hats laden with snow. They were rough, their eyes wary, but their stance conveyed a raw desperation that bypassed her usual caution. "We're lost," one rasped, his voice hoarse. "Caught in this white hell. Any chance of shelter, ma'am? Just till the storm breaks?" Ilara's gaze lingered on their faces, searching for a hint of recognition, any flicker that might connect them to the life she had abandoned. There was none, only the grim, unyielding weariness of men who had faced the wilderness and nearly lost. Her lips, chapped and dry, parted, but no words came. The cold rushed in, carrying with it the scent of wet wool and horseflesh, a stark contrast to the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs that usually filled her cabin. She nodded curtly, stepping aside, and the two cowboys stumbled in, bringing with them a torrent of icy air and the undeniable presence of the outside world. They stamped their feet, shaking snow from their coats, their movements clumsy in the confined space. Ilara watched them, her hand still loosely gripping the rifle. Their eyes, though tired, swept over the sparse furnishings, the simple hearth, the single cot, a quiet assessment, a professional curiosity, inherent in men who lived on the edge of trust. She felt their questions hanging in the air, unspoken yet palpable. Why was a woman living alone out here? What was her story? She offered no answers, only a gesture towards the fire, a tacit invitation to warm themselves. This was the dance of the frontier, a cautious exchange between strangers. Her past was a tight knot in her chest, a fear that any loose thread, any misplaced word, might unravel the carefully constructed anonymity she wore like a shroud. She remembered a different time, a grander house, the rustle of silk, the laughter that used to come so easily. It was a fleeting shadow, a ghost of a memory, immediately pushed back into the recesses of her mind. She would not allow that ghost to betray her. The present was a stark reality. Two strangers in her sanctuary, and the storm outside showing no sign of abating. The quiet hum of the fire was now punctuated by the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their boots, a new rhythm in her solitary existence. The silence in the cabin stretched, heavy and thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the insistent howl of the wind outside. Ilara moved with quiet purpose, the scent of fresh coffee beginning to permeate the air, a small comfort against the chilling presence of the storm and the silent scrutiny of her unexpected guests. She pulled a cast-iron pot from the hooks above the hearth, the metal groaning under the weight of the rich, dark liquid. The cowboys, still huddled by the fire, watched her every move, their faces grim, unreadable masks. One, a man with a scarred cheek and eyes like chipped flint, finally broke the quiet. "Appreciate it, ma'am. We ain't had a hot meal in days." His voice was low, gravelly, a sound born of hard living and harsh winds. Ilara simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the steaming cups she poured. She offered them silently, her hands steady despite the tremor in her gut. She knew the unspoken questions beneath his words. "Who are you? What brings you to this desolate place?" She offered only the warmth of the coffee, a universal truce on the frontier. Her own thoughts drifted, a dark current beneath the placid surface of her actions. She remembered another meal, long ago, in a different setting. The clinking of silver, the polite laughter, the faces of those who had once called her friend. Then, the shattering silence, the betrayal, the sudden, terrible realization of what she had been forced to do. It was a memory she fought to suppress, a dark stain on her soul. This solitary life, this cabin, was her penance, her escape from the judgment of a world that refused to understand. The cowboys were archetypes of the raw frontier, rugged and untrusting, their presence amplifying her carefully guarded vulnerability. She felt their suspicion, a tangible thing in the small space, and it pricked at the edges of her composure. She was a woman alone, a mystery, and mysteries bred distrust in a land where survival hinged on knowing who to trust and who to fear. The firelight danced across their weathered faces, highlighting the lines of worry and the deep-set shadows of fatigue. They were strangers, but for this brief time, they were bound by the storm, by the shared need for warmth and sustenance. The tension was a living thing, a low hum beneath the surface of the quiet hospitality, awaiting for the storm to break, both outside and within the cabin walls. As the hours dragged on, marked by the relentless shriek of the wind and the diminishing supply of firewood, Ilara found herself settling into an uneasy rhythm with her guests. She moved about the cabin, replenishing the coffee, offering dried jerky and hardtack, meager provisions, but enough to stave off the gnawing hunger that winter brought. The scarred cowboy, who introduced himself as Silas, and his companion, a younger man named Caleb, with a nervous flicker in his eyes, slowly relaxed, their initial wariness giving way to a more natural, if still guarded, demeanor. Their conversation was sparse, limited to observations about the ferocity of the storm and the treacherous trails they had been forced to abandon. Each man spoke in clipped sentences, their words weighted with the unspoken narratives of their lives on the unforgiving plains. Ilara listened, offering little in return, her own voice a rusty instrument, unused to the cadences of casual conversation. Yet, as Caleb recounted a harrowing close call with a pack of wolves, a flicker of something almost akin to empathy touched her. This was the shared burden of existence in this land, the constant fight against the elements, against nature's indifference. It was a reality she understood intimately. But even as this fragile connection formed, the shadows of her past lingered, a cold hand on her heart. She remembered the faces of the jurors, their judgment like a physical blow, the accusations, sharp and unforgiving, murderous, asterisk. The word echoed in the chambers of her mind, a relentless drumbeat that had driven her across half a continent to this desolate haven. She had not been what they called her, not truly, but the truth was a tangled skein, too complex for the rigid simplicity of the law. She had chosen a life over a principle, and the consequences had been absolute. The cabin, her refuge, felt suddenly claustrophobic, the walls pressing in, holding her secret captive. The cowboys, though seemingly harmless, represented the very society she had fled, the judgment she had sought to escape. She yearned for the return of her solitude, for the simple, profound quiet that allowed her to exist without the weight of scrutiny, without the fear that her past would inevitably rise to claim her. The storm outside raged on, a mirror to the turmoil within. The scent of damp earth and distant pine needles, carried on a gust of wind less brutal than before, filtered into the cabin, a subtle herald of change. The blizzard, after what felt like an eternity, had begun to relent. The howling wind was still present, but it no longer possessed the raw, malevolent fury of the night. Snow still fell, but it was softer, less blinding, and through the occasional break in the swirling white, the dim promise of a dawn, muted and distant, could be glimpsed. Silas and Caleb stirred, their movements more purposeful. The shared silence of the night, steeped in the common fight for survival, had softened the edges of their initial suspicion, but it had not erased it entirely. Elara observed them, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Their departure was imminent, and with it, the return to her solitary existence. Yet, something about their impending leave-taking felt heavier than relief. "Looks like it's breaking," Silas grunted, rubbing his beard, his gaze sweeping over the white landscape visible through the window. "We best be moving. Gotta catch up to our outfit." Caleb nodded, already gathering his meager possessions. Elara felt a prickle of unease. There was a lingering quality to Silas's gaze, a subtle shift in his posture that suggested more than mere gratitude for shelter. He looked at her, truly looked, not just at the woman who had given them warmth, but as if trying to piece together a puzzle. His eyes seemed to bore into her, searching for something hidden, something she had meticulously kept buried. A cold dread seeped into her bones. Had she let something slip? A word, a gesture, a flicker of emotion? Her past was a shadow, but shadows lengthened in the dim light of approaching dawn. The easy camaraderie of the night, born of necessity, was dissolving, leaving behind the stark reality of strangers once more, with their own paths, and their own unspoken reasons for traversing this desolate land. She remembered the glint of a silver locket, a small, intricate piece she always wore, hidden beneath her simple dress. Had he seen it? Was that the flicker of recognition she had so desperately feared? The open loop of their brief encounter, the uncertainty of what they might have perceived or suspected, weighed heavily in the silence. The quiet tension in the cabin was palpable, a fragile skin stretched taut over an unspoken truth. The storm outside might have eased, but a new, more personal storm seemed to be gathering, its first drops falling silently within the confines of her small, isolated world. Silas, instead of heading for the door with Caleb, lingered by the hearth, his gaze falling upon the very object Elara had feared, a silver locket, barely visible on a thin leather thong around her neck, peeking out from beneath the simple linen of her dress. Her hand flew to cover it, a futile, instinctive gesture, but it was too late. A flicker of recognition, stark and immediate, crossed Silas's weathered face. His eyes, which moments before had held only the weariness of the road, now sharpened, narrowing with an unsettling intensity. "That locket," he said, his voice low, no longer gravelly with fatigue but with a sudden, chilling precision. "I've seen one like it before, or heard tell of it. A woman, from back east. A story, a dark one." The air in the cabin thickened, growing heavy with unspoken accusations. Caleb, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, stopped by the door, his hand on the latch, his young face etched with confusion and a dawning apprehension. Elara's breath hitched in her throat, a cold stone lodging itself in her chest. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the distant, weakening moan of the wind. The storm outside had not yet fully passed, but the storm within the cabin had begun to rage. Her past, once a distant echo, was now a tangible presence, standing before her in the form of this hardened cowboy's accusing gaze. Every muscle in her body tensed, ready for flight, for fight, for anything but the inevitable confrontation. She could feel the blood draining from her face, leaving her cold and clammy. The ground she had meticulously carved out for herself, this fragile piece, was crumbling beneath her feet. This was it, the moment she had dreaded for years, the moment the world caught up. The line of riders, though not yet visible, felt palpably closer, an invisible procession already sweeping over the plains towards her. Silas's eyes, fixed on hers, were like a brand, searing into her soul. There was no escape from their knowing. The unspoken question, heavy with implied accusation, hung in the air. Are you her? Her heart hammered, a frantic drum against her ribs. The slow-burn tension of the night had ignited, flaring into an inferno. She could feel the heat of the approaching judgment, a heat that promised to consume everything she had built. Before Alara could even attempt to form a denial, a new sound cut through the pre-dawn quiet, a distant, rhythmic thudding that resonated through the packed snow. Hoofbeats, many of them. Silas turned his head, his gaze sweeping towards the window, a grim confirmation settling over his features. "Looks like you got company, ma'am," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet heavy with implication. Caleb, eyes wide with alarm, pushed the door open slightly, peering out. His sharp intake of breath was all the confirmation Alara needed. They were here. The line of riders, a dark, imposing procession against the pale, snow-laden plains, emerging from the lingering wisps of the storm like specters of retribution. The image was stark, a tableau of approaching judgment. The low hum of the wind outside seemed to carry their presence, a growing thrum that vibrated through the very timbers of the cabin. Alara felt a strange sense of detachment, a chilling calm descending upon her, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the inevitable confrontation. She had fled, had hidden, had built a life on the fragile foundation of anonymity. But the past, like a relentless tracker, had finally caught her scent. The riders drew closer, their forms growing clearer, the glint of metal on their saddles, the determined set of their shoulders visible even from a distance. They were not mere cowboys. They were men of purpose, of authority, carrying the weight of a legalistic, unyielding world. They were the very embodiment of the societal figures she had sought to escape. Stern, unyielding, demanding accountability. Each hoofbeat was a drum stroke, announcing their arrival, signaling the end of her fragile peace. She could almost feel the cold, collective gaze of the world upon her. Silas watched her, his own face a study in grim anticipation. The tension inside the cabin was a living, breathing entity, a suffocating presence. This was not a plea for shelter. This was a summons. The quiet, isolated life she had so painstakingly crafted was about to be torn asunder, its threads frayed by the relentless pursuit of justice, or what passed for it in the unforgiving stretches of the American West. The storm had broken, but the true reckoning was just beginning. The riders, a dozen strong, pulled their horses to a halt just yards from the cabin, their forms stark silhouettes against the muted light of the morning. They were men of the law, she knew, their long coats and stern visages unmistakable. Their leader, a grim-faced marshal, dismounting with a deliberate, heavy tread. The air thrummed with their silent judgment, a palpable weight pressing down on the small cabin. Silas stepped back, a silent observer now, his face unreadable, his alliance clearly not with her. Caleb, looking small and terrified, retreated further into the shadows of the cabin. The marshal, his eyes like chipped ice, fixed directly on Alara, who stood in the doorway, framed by the rough-hewn timbers, her face pale but resolute. "Alara Vance," his voice was a flat pronouncement, devoid of inflection, yet carrying the crushing weight of authority. "We have a warrant for your arrest, for the murder of Samuel Thorne." The name, spoken aloud after so many years of silence, ripped through the fragile fabric of her composure. A brutal incision. It was a ghost she had tried to bury, a wound that had never truly healed. A gasp caught in her throat, a sound of raw anguish, a testament to the pain that still clung to her. She wanted to deny it, to scream, to lash out against the injustice. But the words stuck in her throat, replaced by a torrent of memories. Flashback, asterisk, the flickering lamplight in the study, the heavy scent of brandy, Samuel's enraged face, his hand raised, ready to strike her younger sister, her own hand, trembling, reaching for the antique letter opener, the gleam of metal in the low light, the desperate plea, the single, swift thrust, the terrible, blossoming stain on his waistcoat, the horror, the immediate, crushing realization of what she had done and why. It was not murder, not in her heart, but an act of protection, a desperate defense of innocence against brutality. But the world, the law, saw only the dead man, the weapon, the blood. They saw only the cold facts, stripped of context, devoid of the harrowing truth. The memory flashed, sharp and agonizing, then receded, leaving her trembling in the present, facing the cold, unyielding gaze of the marshal. She began, her voice a reedy whisper. It was self-defense. For my sister. The words were an old, familiar lament, but they fell flat, meaningless in the face of the unwavering authority before her. The marshal's face remained impassive, unmoved by her quiet desperation. The net had finally closed. The marshal took another step forward, his gaze unyielding, cutting through Alara's desperate plea. Self-defense is for the courts, ma'am, not for a woman to decide with a blade in the dead of night and then flee across a continent. His words were blunt, designed to strip away any remaining pretense, to reduce her complex truth to a simple, legalistic lie. The injustice of it all, the cold, unfeeling machinery of the law, twisted a new knife in her gut. She had saved her sister, saved her from a life of abuse, from the tyrannical shadow of a man who saw women as property. But in doing so, she had condemned herself. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had acted out of love, out of a fierce, protective instinct, and it had branded her a criminal, forced her into this desolate exile. Her moral ambiguity was laid bare, not as a choice of evil, but as a desperate act of impossible ethics, a choice between two unbearable wrongs. She was just a child, Ilara whispered, her voice cracking, the raw emotion finally breaking through her carefully constructed facade. He would have ruined her. I had no other choice. Her eyes, filled with a wellspring of pain and an unyielding regret, pleaded not with the marshal, but with the silent, unseeing world around them. It was a desperate, rhetorical question, hurled into the vast, indifferent plains. What would they have done? What choice did a woman have in a world where men held all the power, where justice was a weapon wielded by the powerful against the weak? Her words, though choked with sorrow, carried a poetic undertone, a mournful lament for the lost innocence, the shattered lives. Silas, who had been listening intently, shifted his weight, a flicker of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps pity, crossing his scarred face. Caleb, still wide-eyed, seemed to grasp the tragic weight of her confession, the profound depth of her sacrifice. The marshal, however, remained unmoved. He saw only a fugitive, a woman who had broken the law. His hand moved slowly to the handcuffs at his belt, the metallic glint a stark symbol of her impending fate. The silence stretched, tense and agonizing, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind, carrying the echoes of her desperate truth across the vast, snow-laden expanse. The climax was here, raw and exposed, her entire being stripped bare before the unyielding eyes of judgment. The marshal's hand, grim and unyielding, reached for her. But Ilara did not flinch, did not struggle. The fight had left her, replaced by an exhausted resignation. The weight of her past, of her impossible choice, had finally crushed her beneath its unforgiving burden. She had run for so long, lived with the constant ache of fear, and now, oddly, there was a strange, cold calm. The metallic click of the handcuffs around her wrists was sharp, final, a blunt punctuation mark at the end of her solitary chapter. The cold steel bit into her skin, a tangible reminder of the world's harsh decree. She looked around her cabin, her sanctuary, now invaded and defiled by the presence of these men, these enforcers of a justice that felt profoundly unjust. The hearth fire, once a beacon of warmth, now seemed to mock her, its flames dancing with an indifferent cheerfulness. "Mount up," the marshal commanded, his voice echoing in the small space, and the cowboys, including Silas and Caleb, began to gather their horses, their movements swift and efficient. Ilara was led outside, the bitter wind immediately biting at her exposed skin. The snow, though softer, was still deep, each step a struggle. She stumbled, and a hand, surprisingly, Silas's, steadied her. He said nothing, but his eyes, for a fleeting moment, met hers, and in their depths, she saw not condemnation, but a flicker of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the harsh realities of this land and the desperate measures it sometimes demanded. It was a small, unexpected grace in a moment of utter desolation, a tiny seed of humanity in a landscape of cold, unyielding law. The line of riders formed, their horses snorting plumes of white breath into the frigid air, and Alara was hoisted onto a spare mount, her bound hands making it difficult. The saddle was cold, the leather stiff beneath her. She looked back at her cabin, her home, her penance, already receding into the vastness of the snow-covered plains. It was a raw, aching farewell. There would be no return, not to this life, not to this solitude. The hope for resolution, though dark, was born not of external circumstance, but from the quiet acceptance of her fate. The running was over. The journey back was a blur of biting wind, endless white plains, and the rhythmic plod of hooves, each beat a step further from the only home Alara had known in years. Her hands, still bound, ached with a dull, persistent pain, a physical manifestation of the crushing weight on her spirit. Yet, beneath the layers of despair, a peculiar calm had settled within her. The gnawing fear, the constant vigilance, the relentless burden of a hidden past, all of it had been replaced by a quiet, exhausted clarity. She had faced the judgment, the raw, unfeeling gaze of the law, and in a strange, twisted way, it was a release. The illusion of freedom, the solitary existence she had carved out, had been a cage of a different sort, built from fear and self-imposed exile. The future was uncertain, grim, undoubtedly confined, but it was also a path, however bleak, that led somewhere definitive, no longer adrift in the endless, silent expanse. She thought of her sister, the reason for it all, a quiet strength emerging from the depths of her pain. She had saved her. That truth, above all others, remained unshakable, a solitary, defiant beacon in the vast darkness of her circumstances. The irony of her situation, bound and led away for an act of love, was a sharp, bitter edge, yet it was also a truth that no verdict could ever erase. The world might brand her a murderer, but in the crucible of her heart, she was a protector. The sun, a pale, anemic orb, began to sink towards the western horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the snow. The ride continued, endless and cold, but within her, a faint ember of hope, dark and resilient, flickered. It was not hope for freedom, not in the traditional sense, but hope for a reckoning, a chance, however slim, to finally speak her truth, to lay bare the impossible choice that had defined her life. The journey was far from over, the path ahead shrouded in the chilling mists of the unknown, but the burden of hiding, of being hunted, had finally lifted. The stillness of the vast, snow-covered landscape held a new, echoing quality, a silent testament to the raw, untamed spirit that had driven her actions and would continue to define her, even in chains.